So this video segment is actually going to be included in a couple of different playlists. So you might have gotten to this through part 3 of the chapter 14 lecture notes for my Psych 301 class. But this is also going to be included in the how to conduct and interpret the output from a 2x2 between subjects ANOVA using SPSS. So this video is relevant to both those situations. So let me go through giving you an example first that we're going to work with. So here's my example. So let's say that we want to see if being a student or not and having a job or not has any kind of impact on caffeine consumption. So in this study, the researcher asked participants if they were a student currently or not. They also asked participants if they currently have a job or not. And then they asked them how many caffeinated beverages they typically consume each week. So participants were answering this question on caffeine consumption in a numeric sort of way. So in looking at the different hypotheses that we have to test here, in a factorial ANOVA, remember that we have several different hypotheses that we will test. So the first hypothesis that we're going to test, or the first set of hypotheses that we're going to test, is going to be to examine the main effect for that first factor. So the first factor listed in this study was whether people were students or not. So that factor student has 2 levels, so people are either students or they're not. The second hypothesis set that we're going to test is the main effect for the second factor. In this example, our second factor is whether people have a job or not. So that factor of job also has 2 levels where people either have a job or they do not have a job. And the third hypothesis that we're going to test in this example is the interaction between being a student and having a job. And so one other thing to point out here is that this is a between subjects design because people are either students or not. So that factor was measured in a between subject sort of way. People are also having a job or not having a job. So it's 2 groups of completely different people that have jobs versus don't have jobs. So when we're thinking about what type of research design is used, we think about the research design involved in each of our factors independently. So student is a between subjects variable, so is job. It's a between subjects variable, so this would be a 2x2 between subjects ANOVA. So one of the major things that's really useful when doing a factorial ANOVA is to use tables and graphs in ways to help you understand all the information that you have. So we're first going to talk a little bit about the tables that we can use when we're doing a factorial design. And then later on, we're going to talk more about the graphs and figures that we can use and how they can help us interpret our findings. So let's first talk about how to draw tables. So if we were to make a table of our findings, one of the ways to do it is to set up our table such that one of our factor is represented by the columns and then the other factor is represented by the rows. So in our example here, our 2 factors are student and job. So it doesn't really matter which of your 2 factors you have as the columns and which one you have as the rows, just as long as one factor is the columns and the other factor is the rows. So let's go ahead and set this up with student as the columns. So you'll see that I have the student is up here labeled at the top of the columns. So we had people who either said, yes, I am a student, or we had people who said, no, I'm not a student. So student, yes, is going to be the columns here. People who said, no, I'm not a student are going to be represented here. And then you'll see that I moved my other factor over here to be represented by the rows. So here we have the people who said, yes, I have a job are going to be in this row. People who said, no, I don't have a job are going to be in this row. So you can also see here that this then gives us 4 unique, what we call cells, that are representing the combination of our 2 factors. So this cell here represents the people who said, yes, I am a student, and yes, I have a job. Versus down here, this would be the people who said, yes, I am a student, but no, I don't have a job. Over here we have the people who said, no, I'm not a student, but yes, I had a job. And then finally we have, no, I'm not a student, and no, I don't have a job. So set up the table first, and then I would use your SPSS output to fill in these different cells. I don't find SPSS output to always be maybe the easiest thing to look at, and that is no exception here. So we're going to look at the descriptive statistics from your SPSS output. So this is an option that you have to ask the program to give you. So make sure to select the option to get the descriptive statistics. Once you have those, your descriptive statistics will present each of your different combinations of your factors. So you'll see that this first row here in our output represents the people who said, so this is below the, are you currently a student? Yes. And then, do you have a job? Yes. That is the mean for the people in that group. And then also we have the number of people who said yes to both those questions. So there's our mean for the people who said, yes, I'm a student, and yes, I have a job. And that's the number of people that were in that group. So we can just fill in our table here to represent the mean for that group, as well as the number of people in that group. So I rounded that 6.896, I rounded that to 2 numbers after the decimal point, which ends up being 6.90. So APA style always has us report our numbers with only 2 numbers after the decimal point. So next, let's look for the mean corresponding to the people who said, yes, I am a student, but no, I don't have a job. So yes, I am a student, no, I don't have a job is going to go right here into this box. So looking here, yes, I'm a student, no, I don't have a job, the mean would be right there, and there's our n. So the mean is 5.38 with the n being 40. Next, let's fill in the blanks for no, I'm not a student, but yes, I have a job. So that would be right here. So we got no, I'm not a student, but yes, I have a job. There's the mean for them, and there's the n for that group as well. So the number of people in that group was 59. And then last but not least, we want to find the mean associated with people who said, no, I'm not a student, no, I don't have a job. So we'll find that here, no, I'm not a student, no, I don't have a job. That's the mean of that group, and there is their n, the sample size, the number of people that are in that group. So I think it's just easier to look at these means once you've put them into your own table, so you can help keep track of all the different bits of information that you're going to be working with here. So let's first talk about how we can go ahead and examine our main effects. So I mentioned earlier that we're going to have a bunch of different hypothesis tests that we're going to conduct. So the first ones that we want to conduct are going to be the main effects. And so in order to examine the main effects, we actually have to compute, or actually just identify on the SPSS output, what's called the marginal means. The marginal means represent the mean for each level of an individual factor, basically just ignoring the other factor. So our 2 factors in this example are whether you're a student or not, and then the other factor would be whether you have a job or not. So the marginal mean will look at each level of an individual factor. So let's work with the student factor. So we had people who said, yes, I am a student, and people who said, no, I'm not a student. The marginal means would just look at the means for all of the people who said, yes, I'm a student, and the mean for all the people who said, no, I'm not a student, essentially just ignoring whether they had a job or not. So we're going to look at the data in a second to see how we can do that. And what the main effect is testing is it's looking at the difference between those two means, those two marginal means. So again, that would be comparing the mean for people who said they are students to the mean for the people who said they're not students. So that is what's being tested in the main effect. And as I mentioned earlier, each of these hypothesis tests are separate tests. So we're going to use a separate ANOVA to test each of our main effects. So these analyses are completely independent of each other, which means you can have any combination of significant or non-significant results for each of the different hypothesis tests that we're going to do here. So keep that in mind. You can have any kind of combination of findings across these three hypothesis tests that we're going to do. So let's first talk about our first hypothesis test that we're going to do, and that is going to be looking at the main effect for the first factor. So the first factor in this study was whether you're a student or not. So the first main effect is going to examine people who are students versus not students and how much caffeine that they're consuming. So when looking at the hypotheses for this first hypothesis test, our null hypothesis is that students, on average, remember that we're stating this about the population level, so students on average, they consume about the same amount of caffeine, or they consume exactly the same amount of caffeine as non-students. So these two groups are equal in their caffeine consumption. So we're always testing the null hypothesis to see, did we find a big enough difference to say that it's wrong? So we're hoping instead for support for our alternative hypothesis, which is that students, they consume a different amount of caffeine than non-students. So these are the two competing hypotheses that we're examining. So the one we're directly testing, though, is going to be our null hypothesis. So the next step here would be to examine the actual marginal means. So the marginal means, again, it's just looking at trying to compare everybody who's a student to everybody who's not a student. And again, we're ignoring whether they have a job or not. And so the whole reason why it's called marginal means is that we'll present these down here in the margins of our table. So they're not in the cells of our table. Instead, they're in the margins or on the outside of our table. So we'll put this mean right here of 6.38. That is the mean for every single person who said, yes, I'm a student. So we can get that from our SPSS output right here in the, are you currently a student? Yes. The total row, that represents your marginal mean, or the mean, the combined mean for every single person who said that they're a student. That's how much caffeine they're consuming on average per week. So that's one marginal mean. Our other marginal mean would be for all the people who said, no, I'm not a student. This total represents the combined mean of every single person in this group who said, no, I'm not a student. Again, we're ignoring whether they have a job or not. We don't care about that for our main effects. So the combined mean for every single person that said, no, I'm not a student, is going to be 12.81. So that is the marginal mean for not being a student. So these two marginal means are actually what are being compared in the main effect hypothesis test. So the main effect is going to compare whether this mean is significantly different from that mean.